So we're moving on to content area 2B. So 2A, remember, was the ancient Near East. And we looked at Sandman and we looked at Egypt. And so for the ancient Mediterranean 2B, we are going to be looking at the Etruscans and the Greeks and the Romans. And it's a lot of material, but I'm going to try to get through it pretty quick for you guys. So there's some of our themes we're going to be talking about, and hopefully you remember these things from back in the day. Again, these PowerPoints or Google Slides are shared with you guys, so you can look back through them and hopefully you have your notes. So there's some of the key ideas we talk about with the these, what we kind of lump under as classical eras. The Etruscans, remember, are those pre-Romans. The Etruscans have a lot of practices and clothing and language and all these things, that mythology that we associate with the Greeks and Romans, that actually came from the Etruscans. Most of the art we see from the Etruscans is funerary, because the Romans just built right on top of the Etruscans. And so the work that we have left was buried, right? So the sarcophagus of the spouses is the first piece we looked at. We talked about how these were in above ground tombs. Remember that the Etruscans cremated, so inside here would actually be a container of ashes, not a full body. We talked about how these are archaic, and the Etruscan works that we have in our canon are archaic, and we can tell because of that archaic smile, which is supposed to show well-being and life, not really happiness, although they do look quite jolly. Remember that this work would receive offerings. Likely they are holding some sort of receptacle that would receive an offering, some sort of dish, or an egg. An egg would also represent rebirth in the afterlife. Very stylized forms. Women were almost equal in the Etruscan world, which was a rarity. The architecture that we associate again as being classical Greek or Roman actually starts with the Etruscan. So the Temple of Minerva was our example of Etruscan architecture. The reason we don't have it anymore is because, again, it was, well, one, it was built out of wood and mud brick, but two, the Romans built on top. So Vitruvius documented these buildings before they were destroyed by the Romans, and so we do have documentation. Remember that the Temple of Minerva had Apollo on top, and Apollo was here facing Heracles along the top kind of center part, and it was reenacting a scene from the labors of Heracles. Looked at the tomb of the triclinium. The triclinium, or I'm sorry, the Etruscans are using fresco here to paint their walls. The reason that the red is the most prominent is because it is the one that really soaked into the plaster and has dyed the plaster most. The funerals for the Etruscans, remember, were these grand events that would be multi-days long, and they would involve the games, the bloodletting games, which eventually evolved into the gladiatorial games for the Romans. They would involve dances and banquet and music, and it was really a celebration of that person's life. So the iconography, the images within the tombs, kind of speak to that convivial, jolly existence. Remember that the tombs always had a red door, and through that red door was the door, that was the door to the afterlife. And it's called triclinium simply because the room is decorated similar to how the dining rooms found at Pompeii were aligned. All right, let's move into Greece. I know we're going quick, but you guys have learned all this before. So the Greeks are really going to be focused on mathematic perfection. Um, Humanism was a new thing we talked about with the Greeks. Ideal proportions. Remember, they figured out how to make a perfectly realistic representation of a human, and then they were like, ah, that's boring. They started exaggerating to the ideal form. Civic ideals. Skip all this. So we talked about the agora. Remember agora and Acropolis. A lot of people got those mixed up. So the agora is at the ground level, right, at Athens, and then the Acropolis is up above it. So the agora is the place for public discourse, voting, law, courts. This is where all the philosophers would talk and hang out. It's a public space. Up top is the sacred space, the Acropolis. Added to over time. The Anasavas Chorus, we talked about how this is a evolution from the power figures of the Egyptians. This was a grave marker. He's supposed to look heroic and strong. Peplus Kore, this was found at the Acropolis. It was likely a goddess, could have been brought there as an offering, could have adorned one of the kind of outdoor fire pits for on top of the Acropolis for offerings. It could have been part of a fountain. We're not exactly sure, but it was at the Acropolis. She's wearing what we think might be a peplos. Niobetus crater is a container, a vase, if you will, that is decorated in what we call red figure, right? Because the figures are red. So there's either red figure or black figure. This is red figure. And the figures have that kind of awkwardness of the early classical, what we'd expect to see. All we've looked at so far is early classical. It tells the story on one side of Niobe. Remember, she bragged about her kids being more beautiful and more plentiful than Artemis and Apollo. And so Artemis and Apollo come and kill all her kids. Never show hubris or that amount of pride or bragging to the gods. That was the lesson there. And then the other side showed Hercules standing victorious. So cute. Doryphoros, spear bearer, whatever you call this man. Polykleitos, I think this was our first artist. And this is, remember, a Roman copy. The Greek original would have been bronze. It would have stood on its own without the weird wedge and block and tree trunk. This was displayed in a Roman gymnasium area in Pompeii, and it was there to inspire athletes, even though it's originally a Greek object. So in its original context, Polykleitos created this based on contrapposto, based on that harmony of opposites, the weight shift between the contracted muscles and the relaxed muscles. He created this as a perfect ideal form of a human man. But yet the face still feels very lifeless compared to Bernini, right? But it's a big change there. Acropolis, again, the agora is at ground level, the Acropolis is up high. The Acropolis was a site of multiple buildings built to honor the gods of the polytheistic gods of mythology of Greece, which remember they really got those from the Etruscans and the Romans, but you know, everybody shares everything. So this is the kind of layout here. Now, the majority of the buildings here are for Athena, hence we are in Athens, but there are also other kind of minor things going on for other gods. To get to the Acropolis, you walked along the sacred way through the agora. High Classical is 5th century BCE. There's the ruins of it. mathematic perfection, built with those drums that stacked on top. Some of the pediment sculptures. Temple of Athena, Nike is out on the corner there. Victory. We talked about wet silk. The Ergostines were the women who were trained to bring the peplos, the gown to put on the sculpture of Athena. And we talked about the debate of whether or not these marbles have been taken from Athens by Lord Elgin and have been in the British Museum for 100 and some odd years, should stay or should be given back. So we're still in the high classical here. This is the grave stele of Higeso. Callimachus is the artist, we think, and this was a funerary marker. It shows the woman still in her domestic space, a servant and a woman. It was painted. The Hellenistic is where we started talking about pathos and an emotional response from the viewer. So this is Hellenistic, winged victory, winged Nike, Nike of Samothrace, lots of different things you can use here, but it's this elegant forward thrust form. So if you're going to compare it to earlier things, you would talk about how this sculpture shows movement. It shows the effect of the environment on her body, right? That silk's clinging to her body. You could talk about the fact that this was similar in the sense it was commemorative. It commemorates a naval battle. Great altar of Zeus and Athena at Pergamon. Remember that the Greeks have spread so far. They've spread out into what we now have as West Asia. And so this is at Turkey. It was an altar that was part of a larger Acropolis built there, and this would have had a fire burning for Zeus and Athena. We talked about how three-dimensional this relief is, how the figures really come out from the background and spill out onto the stairs. Gigantomachy, it's the gods fighting the giants. This was symbolic for the Greeks' victory over the Gauls. And it's rebuilt inside the Berlin Museum. Seated boxer, oops, what's happening here? This was found at a bathhouse, and so we know that the Romans took it and they put it in a bathhouse once this Greek civilization had gone. It is a emotional kind of response here as we look at this fighter who can tell is strong and capable, but appears defeated, and so it has this more informal posture, how he's sitting kind of hunched forward. You would want to talk about the idealized muscles, but then also the effects of the fighting on his face. We have those scars that had copper inlaid in them, the furrowed brow. The reason that this was not melted down is a little unclear. Again, we know it was put at the baths. We know it might have been a talisman that had been touched for good luck. But it is strange that we still have the Greek bronze, not the Roman marble. And there's where it's found. So hollow wax casting is how they used to make these. You would have had inset eyes. Okay, that was all for Greece. Wow, all of Greece in 14 minutes. I'm impressed. Okay, let's move on to Rome. Rome is building much bigger structures than the Greeks. And it's because they have developed concrete, right? They don't have the marble amounts that the Greeks did for architecture. So Greeks are building with marble, but they're making sculptures with bronze. The Romans are building with concrete and making sculptures with marble, right? The arches come along with the Romans. The barrel arch, remember that simple barrel arch? The house of Vetti or Weti was our first Roman work, and we talked about this. Remember, it's two brothers who were freed slaves, and this they might not have literally been brothers, but relatives, friends, and they and their families lived here. It was the second biggest house in Pompeii. We talked about the fact that the home is all oriented to face interior rather than exterior. Like many of us have porches or, like things in our house, lots of windows that face out. Everything in these ancient Roman houses faced in. And so you had a courtyard in the middle that was kind of this oasis. We talked about how important the Roman domus or domi home was to the patron-client relationship, because business meetings would happen here in the atrium. And then in some of the homes, not this one, but some of the homes had stores out front actually built onto the house. So the atrium is that place, that room where you really have to show off. This is where your safe would be. This is where your I'm a gynes, your images of your ancestors would be. Ancestor is very important in this Republic period. They had the wall paintings that were the fourth style, which is the most advanced style of wall paintings. These are true fresco. Oh, who can forget him? All right, the Alexander mosaic is from the biggest house in Pompeii, the House of Fawn. It's a mosaic, and it's a Roman mosaic based on a Greek wall painting. And it depicts the Battle of Issus, Alexander the Great versus Darius. And it's that moment of the battle where Alexander's like gonna definitely win. It's like that. So mosaic made it durable. It was a floor, but yet it still gave the opportunity to have modeling to look three-dimensional. Tessera are the pieces of mosaic. Still in the Republic period, the Romans were very big on realism, to the point that it kind of becomes absurd. So we call this verism. Veristic means truth, means you are depicting, you are looking at a sculpture or a person, and you are making their sculpture to show everything about them, every wrinkle, every wart, every scar. Because they valued age, they valued specificity, they valued your ancestral lineage. Look how fast we're going. All right, so we've moved out of the Republic period. The Republic, Rome was ruled by a Senate, and now we're moving into the imperial first century. The imperial period was our period of emperors. So this is Augustus Suprema Porta. I know we've talked a lot about him, power and authority. The Colosseum. The Colosseum was built on top of Nero's, where Nero had his Domus Aureus, his golden house, his lake, all this. And so really the Colosseum was built to give this land back to the people as a place of entertainment, as a place of bringing people together, even though it was very, very violent. Had it was only possible because of concrete. Remember, it had the different orders on the top of the layers here. So the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and then the Valerium was the sail across the top. And then it becomes spoila later on. And so most of the marble from the seats have been taken. So Vespasian was the emperor who did this, who gave this back. Again, I'm going through these real quick, but y'all have this PowerPoint if you need to look through it more. I would definitely have that at your fingertips as you're studying. The Forum of Trajan is almost all just ruins now, but we talked about this as being a public forum in Rome, and it was to glorify the emperor, in this case, Trajan. So many emperors had forums. So the column is still standing. Parts of the Basilica Olpia are standing, parts of the markets are standing, but the majority of the structure is gone. It had a basilica, and a basilica, remember, is a rectangular shaped space. It's what the Christian churches start basing their architecture on. Had markets. The column was historiated. It told a story. It told the story of the campaigns against the Dacians, which modern day Romania, the Dacians. And so it's a narrative. It's telling that story of the war and violence, but then also the power of Trajan. This object was funerary at one point. His ashes were down here in the bottom. Remember, it used to be topped with a nude sculpture of Trajan, and then the Catholics were like, get him out of here. And so now it is St. Peter dressed. We don't know how this was meant to be viewed. There's still a lot of unknowns about it. Pantheon. Pantheon is likely a temple for all the gods, but it was more than that. It was we know it was a law court. We know it became a Christian church. So it's a government, a public building that also is sacred. So it has a lot of different functions. It's our first dome. So this is a barrel with a dome on top, and then it had the oculus, the eye, the hole in the middle. It has the pediment across the front with the columns. Remember that a lot of this material is spoila brought in from Egypt. And we talked about circle square. We talked about the fact that when you would come through that main door, it's going to fill your field of vision. We talked about coffers in the ceiling. So this is a huge innovation, a big change to go from rectangular temples and spaces to circular spaces. Becomes a sundial, which is pretty cool. And lastly, the Ludovisi. This is a battle sarcophagus. It was used obviously as a coffin, right? Sarcophagus, it's a coffin. We think it's for this dude in the middle. We're not for sure, but he was probably a minor emperor. And it's all this cluster, all these bodies together become this chaotic scene of war. It doesn't have like a lot of clarity. It's a lot of clustering together. It's a very high relief marble. We're very late here, 250 CE. Likely this is Hostilian. You can see the similarities there. So it's about Roman triumph. That's what this piece is about. It's carved from a single piece of marble. Talked about spoila. All right, and then here at the end are some pieces you can look through. That's all of content area 2. Look how fast we went. So please go through this stuff. Make sure you remember these things. Right?